When I want to know about esports, I go to his channel. This is Steel and you're watching Thorin.
Now, speaking of Eddie, little old Edward there, right? Edward has retired. Now, technically, he didn't explicitly say, I am just retired. He pointed out that he's having a child, and because he doesn't want to miss the important things in their life, he's going to step back from active play because he was playing for ESC. If people don't know, it's the organisation that actually, funnily enough, people like Neo and Taz used to play for at the end of 1.6, if you remember around that time period. This won the last major on that team. So he was playing in that team along with Bondic and some other names you might know from back in the day. And so technically right now he's just said he's stepping out of active play. We don't know that he's totally retired or if this means no more esports career. Maybe he becomes a coach, an analyst. I don't know, but he couldn't, if they bring back having Star Series type events, maybe he could even be a studio analyst. Who knows what he wants to do with his career. So it is possible he comes back, but I decided I actually did already do a Who is Edward video. I did it in 2015 when CSGO was popping off, and I thought if you saw the player wasn't CSGO because he'd already become a supportive element, there's no way people are going to believe this guy was the mega stud rifle god from 1.6. So I had to do the video. So because I already did a Who is Edward, and we're assuming now his career should be over, I decided we'll do a Who was Edward. Look, he's not dead. This isn't a tragic scenario like 6 from Mouse Sports, but I want people to know if there's a player I can think of that is misunderstood and maligned in his Counter-Strike career, but who I can wax lyrical about for ages. I think this guy's mega. This has got to be one of them. This is a player who, if I'm talking about his whole career, seeing him in all versions of Counter-Strike, the raw mechanical talent this player had, this is a very, very special individual. He's one of the best players to ever play any version of Counter-Strike. And I don't think people understand that because of how it ended in CSGO and the fact that now, in theory, his CS career just ends now in 2023 when he was a monster over 10 years ago at this point in time. So first and foremost, this is a guy who came along way before people even understand from the story in the West. So people used to follow websites like Gotfrag, HLTV, SK Gaming, back in the day, will know Edward really started to pop up around 2007 with VP, then 2008, 2009 with the DTS and Hellraisers squads. This is when people really start to notice, eye test wise, this guy's really fucking good. Hey, he's mixing it up with the best players. But he was around before that, because in that region, look, I know it's no longer technically CIS region, because I don't think Ukraine's part of that. But when we called that region of Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, etc., all the CIS region, it's what we used to call it, because they had this very shared land circuit, at that Cyber Arena and other tournaments in Ukraine. They used to have tons of tournaments in Ukraine and Russia, loads of small, medium-sized lands, qualifiers like that would have the top teams that would then lead into bigger lands, and then the best absolute teams with the sponsorship would go to the international tournament. So you wouldn't have seen him until he got into VP, basically. But before that, this guy, when I'm serious, when he was 15 years old, 16 years old, he was going to these lands already where he was already playing against people who are mega veterans now, like fucking Zeus when he came along, Blade, obviously, back in the day, his eventual coach and teammate Kane, obviously. All the mega old school players are Dren. You're going way back in time here. We're talking about the oldest players in the CIS region. He was already playing as a 15, 16-year-old guy who obviously had talent. Then he was even one of the guys who did go to a World Cyber Games with one of the CIS teams, managed to go to one, which was a major back in the day. That was a big deal to go to them. He made his name on those CIS tournaments. It was the ASIS tournaments that were seasonal. It was other tournaments that were within the Ukrainian / the CIS scene that had the best Russian players coming over. And then eventually he got his crack, and this is when the Western scene started to really take notice. He got his crack in Virtus.Pro, the famously Russian lineup. Now, what happened was Zeus came over as well, but not as in-game leader initially. They were both just fraggers at the time. Zeus was far and away a much less famous and less regarded player at the time. Edward was the big catch. But when they came into this team, famously VP had always been a team that historically underperformed internationally, aside from early on when they had that breakout upset over SK at ESWC in 2004. After that, famously, they'd always have these really high-skilled lineups with a bunch of players that can hop and have great deagles, and online they look awesome. But on LAN, they just never would win the LANs. It wasn't even until the end of 1.6, by the way, with the squad that was Moscow 5 with people like Dorsia, that you actually got a team that could even be in a final, conceivably. Before that, to make semis was a big deal. So at this time, they wanted to get the best other talents, not just from the Russian scene. And so they brought in Edward and Zeus, and that meant you were adding that to a team that already had Lex, who was arguably the best player from the region. If it hadn't have been for how Na'Vi ended 1.6, might have even ended 1.6 as the best like body of work individually as a star player, mega skilled all-around player from Russia. And then the other top Russian prospect at the time was the player Romshka, who you might remember played in United later on in later years, etc., and was himself in teams like Moscow 5, etc. This guy was a fabulous, like, raw talent rifler with like aggressive skills and good aim in this squad, which had a real, like, this had a wealth of talent in it. Like I say, Lex and Edward are two of the best fraggers in the game at this point in time already. They were able to win the odd tournament, like they domestically were very dominant. And then you had a tournament called the Intel Challenge Cup that was held yearly within that region. And the one that was in the August of 2007, you had a pretty stacked one. You had alternate attacks come over with people like Roman, the stud lineups. You had Roccat, which was basically like Conte and Ruit and Lurpis, the Finns. You had MIBR, who still had one of the best squads in the world. They came to this tournament, and the winner of this tournament was Virtus.Pro and Edward. So what's interesting is around this era, 2007, 2008, Edward's teams are really domestically dominant. Like, this VP team just does work whenever they're at Russian or Ukrainian lands. Like, later on in 2008, there was a tournament, I might remember, was one of the latter wins of MTW. The Danish squad had been the best team that year, where they won Rekrut, which was a Russian tournament, and second place at this tournament was Virtus.Pro. The only team that was beating them was MTW at that point in time, and all the other domestic teams they could take care of. The problem was when they went internationally, they didn't make much impact. They would just go playoffs of an ESWC and then go out 58th, or they'd be in the group stage and almost make it out. They weren't making these deep runs. And so even though individual talent, someone like Edward, really had it and it was starting to get like a bit of buzz around him, that's all it was. In fact, it was essentially the equivalent of people looking at Donk and when he was coming up, people like Monacy and Chiro and Gambit Youngs and saying, hey, this guy's got skills. But the difference is these were LANs, and these were playing against the best teams in the world on LAN. And now you're moving up the LAN ladder, and we're starting to see that individually you're cracked, even if your team isn't on the level of the Swedes or the Danes or the Finns, etc. In general, we're talking internationally. Obviously, domestically, if the Finnish team came out, they could beat them or be better than them. Then he went back to Ukrainian lineup where he was in the DTS-Gaming lineup with Markelov. I think from memory, there was some weird story. Like, I think in that team, there was like someone maybe who was like his dad or something owned the team or was funding it, and so he had to play with that guy. And so the rest of the teams were always like good play. It was kind of almost like an overdrive scenario. So I think there was even a guy in that team, so that's what held that team back from what I remember. But famously, this was the team where he was partnered with Markelov, and obviously they are the duo that became the studs of Na'Vi and won all the majors a few years later. We're talking now about 2009. The same year, basically the core of that team leaves the guy from DTS and they go to Hellraisers. So now you have a lineup where it's Edward and Markelov, two mega studs. Markelov's already popping off with like real skill in terms of his AWP, and people are starting to also give him a bit of fanfare on Western forums. Jonta, who later was obviously like a coach for Hellraisers, funnily enough, in CSGO, and has been an analyst in the Russian scene. He's actually a guy who was a player on this team. And you had Angel, who obviously in the modern day still plays Valorant to this day. I think he still plays in Na'Vi now. He was a guy who was around, who was known as a frag in IGL, etc. A very talented player in 1.6. By the way, himself, I think, could have been a Na'Vi if he'd wanted to be, or had the appropriate offer at the right time. I've heard there was rumours behind the scenes. So in this Hellraiser squad, now they were like, it was a similar sort of level to the VP squad, but you could just see this is a real dark horse team. You put them into a DreamHack Summer or a World Cyber Games type tournament or an ESWC, and they will have a chance to go playoffs, win a map, maybe threaten a team, one of the top 5, top 6 for a win. But they weren't Na'Vi. They were nowhere close to what Na'Vi became. So the key thing I want to make the point of here, this is why 10 minutes into the video, we haven't talked about Na'Vi's wins yet, is this guy already had buzz as a really good individual prospect and had put in years of play domestically and internationally, so that by the time Na'Vi came, he was just locked and loaded. So was Markelov too, by the way. Markelov also had been percolating, a little bit less of a runway, but you could just see the demos, like the raw eye test showed these guys were studs. So in the same way Markelov had the very fast firing speed, this guy had just the insane lock on aim. It was bonkers. Like, a famous detail I've often mentioned is this is actually one of the ways that Semphis, the North American Canadian player, got his kind of a little bit of fame in esports. He used to be called Terminator and have a Gotfrag account, like a Smurf account or whatever. And one of the players he would always obsess about, he was a big fan of Neo, was also Edward. He was obsessed with Edward and his demos, and he used to talk all the time about them. And everyone at the time was like, is this guy like secretly, Edward this is this guy like secretly the best rifler in the world or something. His skills look impossibly good. The problem is, until you've been in the biggest teams and in the biggest matches at the majors, the biggest venues, and you've won those matches and trophies, understandably, people are always going to give the nod to the people who have done those things, who are the legends of your age. You've got to do it yourself. So all I'll say is this. I do think eye test wise, you didn't have to see this guy in Na'Vi to know he was incredibly talented. This guy's aim was cracked out. I'm talking about with a rifle, his like sort of accuracy when he would flick and when he would make instant firing, I can only compare it to how Simple fires the AWP in CSGO, about how he would just fire so fast and that constant flick style he used to win the clutches. It was the rifle equivalent of that. Like, this guy's aim was fucking unbelievable. It was maybe the best that you could see in 1.6. And I'm talking about, like, as in, he looked more skilled than Neo, even though Neo had impossible skill level. Look, Forrest maybe had the best aim ever, so I can't really see he was better than that, but he was up there. I mean, obviously made the joke later on when he named himself Focus Wow as his little funny alias when he was in Na'Vi. He was better than Forrest a bunch of those years. So the joke was Focus Wow was better than Forrest Wow. He obviously named himself Focus Wow to be an homage to Forrest's famous way of putting Wow at the end of his name in the 1.6 obituary part, if people don't know. Then you come to the Na'Vi team in 1.6. And remember, the story is, for early 2010, this lineup is made from a literal, like, millionaire energy magnate from Kazakhstan who tells Starix, apparently, like, make a squad, but don't make it based on politics and who likes who. Just make the best players in Ukraine, and I'm going to fund you. And you're going to show basically what Ukrainian Counter-Strike could do. Well, people don't know, because they had the Kirchnet spot for Intel Extreme Masters, they went to the European Championship, which wasn't an RMR, it was actually a whole LAN of just European teams. It was, as you can imagine, because Europe was the best in Counter-Strike. It was itself one of the hardest LANs to win. They went to that. Famously, they were able to beat MTW there under the Kirchnet, and with the real Na'Vi lineup, with Zeus and Starix and Senya and all those guys. And on train, which set the precedent that they would always beat them on train, and especially that they always won every single match overall, match, not map, against MTW. And then they didn't manage to get much further because obviously that event famously was won by Mouse Sports with the super team with Roman and Six and God B. And who did Mouse Sports narrowly beat in the playoffs? They beat in 3 maps in a very close series Na'Vi, who later in the year they would match up again and again and again with. And this was one of the great matchups. So they didn't win the first event out the gate. Then they went back. They played under the name, it was called something like Arbalete initially. And what happened was, at this Arbalete tournament, because he also hosted his own tournaments in CIS region with big money, they did one called Arbalete Asia. And I remember they did like a fan thing where it's like fans named the team because they were going to be called like the Na'Vi, but it didn't stand for Natas Vincere. It was just called Na'Vi from like Avatar, the movie. And then people came up with the idea, why not make it Latin and make it Natas Vincere, which means born to win. Which, by the way, now is an incredible name, isn't it? Because they won the next 4 majors and they won quite a lot of championships. One of the most successful teams in the history of esports. Even won fucking TI and all that jazz, didn't they? So after this period, they win the Arbalete Asia tournament, and they're often running at this point in time. They win the next major, IEM Global. In fact, they win the next 4 majors in a row. They won IEM Global, where they beat Fnatic in the final, who had Threat at the time. They won ESWC, where they beat SK-Gaming in the final, the lineup before they had Forest. Then they won World Cyber Games, where they beat MTW in the final in that epic train overtime game. Then the next year, you had the first IEM, where they repeated and managed to defend their championship, where they beat, this time around, it was obviously the Poles, because they then rematched them the following year and lost finally. So they'd won 4 majors in a row. That first year where they won the 3 in a row, 2010, they broke the prize money record. And at this time, people were saying this is the greatest team to ever play Counter-Strike. After that, by the way, they actually made a 5th major final in a row, which is that they made the ESWC final in 2011 as well, but they lost that one in Na'Vi and Get Right. And then after that, they didn't go to the World Cyber Games because they didn't finish top 2, or they finished like second, but then they didn't have the money to attend the event. And there was some shenanigans. That's why World Cyber Games 2011 wasn't that great in terms of the majors. Now, the key thing to say here is Edward was massively impactful to having that insanely dominant, maybe the best year ever in CS 1.6, 2010. He was himself, even though I think Marklov was the best player that year, I think this guy was at least top 5. I would say he was a top 3 or 4 player himself. And I'm not one of these guys who automatically, if Astralis is the best, then they must have 2 top 5 players. If Fnatic's the best, they must have 2 top 5. I don't believe that. I do think Marklov was number 1, but I think this guy was arguably the best rifler in the world. He was right up there. It was only the very best players in the traces of the world that could maybe say they were better than him. He was an absolute monster, this guy. Not only that, he was a mega combo because Markov was just this fast firing style AWPer, so there was no overlap with their games. They could both just play to their peak ability, doing everything they wanted to do and be monsters. And he was a pistol god. Famously, like that first IM they won, he won so many pistol rounds just single-handedly. I mean, I think against Mouse he won some key ones. This guy was just a beast at winning pistol rounds. But he also just had an amazing all-around game with the rifle. It's why, by the way, I actually think part of why Edward doesn't get the true plaudits he deserves, how good he was at CS 1.6, is because of fucking HLTV and that fucking HLTV top 20 list. Because famously, in 2010, they didn't put Edward the second best Na'Vi player. They put fucking Starix. And their reason why is like there was some, it's almost like that EVP shit. Like there was just some certain matches like against NTW and some of the summer run in 2010 where Starix had like some really big individual games. And so they were like, he's actually the second best. Look, he's the secondary AWPer. But all I'll say is the eye test didn't check out at all. Starix had a way more boring game. His kills were more just in the flow of the game. He was a good player. He was definitely a smart player and had a good mind fat positioning. But Edward was a fucking phenom. Like, seriously, this is out of this world level shit. Like, it's ridiculous to even suggest that, like, Starix was better. So for me, Markle was the clear number one. But right after that, the clear number two is Edward after that. And he was a stud that year. By the way, he was still great in the following years. It was other things in the team that went to shit. It was like the leadership and eventually they swapped from Zeus to Starix. It was like, now Starix ops instead of fucking Markelov. This guy, Edward, was just there murking people all along. I'll show you the stats in a minute. He was just unbelievably good. And so sadly, I do think people don't remember how good he was. This was an all-time great player. This is one of, like, if we want to talk just body of work, ignore all accomplishments. Might be there for accomplishments. He'd be a top 10 player of all time in CS 1.6. Absolutely. That would be a very quick, I don't even need to think much on that one. Like, this guy had years before he was in Na'Vi where he was a stud, and I've seen loads of this guy's demos. That's why I paid, what's his name, Athid, to make that frag movie of his back in the day. So this guy's body of work, really special. Because remember, if you add it all together, we're talking many, many years. It's not just the Na'Vi years at the end, which is more Marklov's sort of run. Quite frankly, I'd even say in 1.6, here's how I'd compare it. As a combo, Marklov and Edward was like simple and electronic, except here's the thing. Marklov was insane, but he wasn't quite what simple is in CSGO. And I'd say it's the other way around. I'd say electronic was really good, but I think Edward's even better as sort of the rightful part of that 1-2 duo. So maybe make the simple part weaker and electronic stronger, and then you'd have a sense of who fucking Edward was in this game. So let's look at his stats a second. I'll just show you some of them, because obviously they have the old legacy stats. So what you do is, if you want to see some of the 1.6 stats, which aren't necessarily super complete, there's many early years they don't have, and they don't have some of the American ones that Got Frag Game Sense had. What you do is you go to hltv.org/legacy stats, all one word, and then it'll load it up for you. It'll give you this very basic old engine. So this is all time, right? So if we look for all time, and it's old rating 1.0 on this right-hand side, if you look here, you don't have to go far till you get Edward. Look, he's only a couple below Forrest. Now, look, obviously someone like Forrest played way more maps, and it's better competition, but look at the kill-to-death ratio and the rating. So Forrest is a 1.28 because he's a fucking monster, and a 1.20 for his whole career. Edward is a 1.29 and a 1.20. Similar stats. Now, why is that true? Edward is farming a bunch of opposition that aren't as good necessarily as Forrest, but the point is, it's the same ballpark. Then let's go year by year. So I think 2009 was the first year I saw that Edward had popped up on here. You can see he's actually one of the highest rated players of the year, 2009. So before he's got in an RV, he's an absolute stud. Look, monster KD, monster kill to death. This is a year when people like Roman of Attacks, Omega, Mouse Spots at this point, at the end of that year, Neo, Get Right For It. You know all these names. They're all mega. Then you go to the year with Na'Vi. Look at these numbers. He's actually the highest rated player from Na'Vi, by the way. He has a 1.30 kill to death, and you're telling me that Starix is better than him? Are you having a fucking laugh? By the way, where are you? And is Starix on this list? And then also, he has a 1.20 rating, which is, again, absurd. Like, that's as good as the best players in the whole world. And here's the difference. He's got a solid sample size considering it's back in 2010. He's got 200 maps on LAN. Like, it's only people like Get Right have better stats than him, guys. He has better stats than Neo this year. This is a down year for the Pauls, but Neo was still good. He just wasn't at his absolute peak. Then you go to 2011, when they win a major, but they're starting to fall off. They're only in 2 major finals, not as many trophies. You go there, what's that? Still an absolute stud. Even better kill-to-death ratio, by the way. Even better rating. Going absolutely fucking ham on loads of maps again. Then you come to the end of 1.6. Remember, they did play the whole time through all the tournaments. They actually switched towards the end of the year to CSGO. They didn't switch early like NIP. He's still one of the absolute monsters. It's not as high, but look at 1.22, 1.115. This guy's a fucking beast. This guy's a fucking monster. Even in the years when Na'Vi goes down and they're not as good, by the way, they're still in major finals because it's fucking Na'Vi, innit? So the key thing for me is this guy's skill set was everything you could want from a 1.6 rifler. Like he essentially was, look, I can't say he's the Nico of rifles, like the greatest rifler ever, because like, let's be real, like, people like Nico, Coldzera, Get Right, they did it for a long time. But I would say in 1.6, after you get Neo, let's say Forest, Potty, now you have to start talking about Edward immediately. Now Edward comes in with the Roman, Edward, like Get Right. These are the players who now get in that mix. Like these are people with that body work. So he had insane aim, mechanically very, very good. Generally just a very strong player with a killer instinct. Amazing pistols, the best rifles in the game, although not an AWPer. And he just a player who performs in big, big matches and turns up and has the gusto, as it were. Now, when it came to CSGO, initially he was playing with the Na'Vi line because they just swapped their 1.6 lineup at the end of the year. Famously, it was for DreamHack Winter 2012. They just brought their 1.6 lineup and made them just play the game immediately. And unsurprisingly, they didn't get cooking that early. In fact, it turned out people like Starix and Senya weren't very fucking good. In CSGO, there's a reason why they got filtered out of the team. But the problem is, Edward didn't stick around initially. What happened was, him and Markelov shocked the world. And same as in 1.6, they left and they went to a Virtus.Pro team. They went and they formed this super team called Astana Dragons. Astana is obviously a place in Kazakhstan. And the premise of this team was a bit like Na'Vi. It was like, hey, we're going to make a super team of CIS players. So they had like a Dren from fucking Kazakhstan, and then they had people like Dorsia from Russia. We're going to take the Virtus.Pro players, this Russian squad, and then we're going to combine it with the 2 stars of 1.6 Na'Vi and fucking a Dren who was a stud from Kazakhstan in 1.6. So essentially, on paper, we're making a fucking unbelievable team here. Think about this. For 1.6, this is a dream team, guys. You've got a Dren who was a stud. You've got Dorsia, who was the best Russian 1.6 player, arguably. You've got fucking Markelov, the best 1.6 CIS player, arguably. Edward, monster player. You've got 4 super killers. The problem is it's CSGO, so they weren't as good a team. So people might remember, early on, this team was good. They were getting cooking. Like you might remember, they actually placed ahead of NIP and came second at that Star Series. It was Star Series 7, which was the one won by Very Games. And then both Very Games and Astana Dragons beat NIP at the time. It was the dominant team and had won all those lands except like 2 ever or something insane, or 3 at this point in time. And so they placed ahead of NIP. The problem was, because they had a dodgy ESWC where they only came 3rd and they managed to lose to the Clan Mystic or whatever they were called, they ended up kicking Edward because he was actually seen to be not that good at this point in time. And they brought in, I think it was Kucha they replaced instead of him. I think that was who they recruited. And basically, then they went to DreamHack Winter. By the way, they actually flopped that and only came 5th to 8th because they lost to Sean Gares' complexity line. They were actually supposed to be in the final or in the semis, at least for that one. So you can even argue, like, was it the right move? Who knows? After they kicked him, he went off and basically rejoined Na'Vi eventually. The problem is, this whole kicking, not being a star in Astana Dragons, transition to CSGO, then coming back to Na'Vi, kind of shows you who Edward had to pivot and become, because eventually he just became a supportive element. He wasn't this just like God rifler anymore. He was a piece that you put in to be clutch, to hold a spot, to give you some good frags, to play well under pressure, to use experience, but not to be the best player in the server. Not anymore. So when he came to Na'Vi, the key thing in Na'Vi is how insane he was at majors. I'm talking seriously fucking insane. Like, look here. So obviously he didn't play the first major because that was the one where he'd been kicked out of Star Dragons. He goes to the second major, kind of 80 onwards. Look, he's with Na'Vi obviously for all these majors. Look at the KPR on some of these majors, guys. So okay, this one here, right? Okay, they bomb it, whatever. It still does okay. Then they go to Cologne where they make top 8 and they lose incredibly narrowly to Fnatic, who's in their second tournament ever with the Crims Olaf line and goes to the final. Look at his fucking numbers, guys. Look at his rating. Look at the kills per round and look at the deaths. This is monstrous. Then he's come in top 4, semi-finals of DreamHack Winter, monster kills again, has an okay Katowice, bad Cologne for his status, bad Cluj-Napoca, which, by the way, they were actually in the final of, so if he played a bit better, maybe they could have won that major. At Columbus, by the way, by his play, he deserves to have won the major at Columbus already. Look at this. This is in the final he's in, guys. 0.85 kills per round. Those are simple numbers. He's at the major, and his deaths are only 0.61. He's not the star player. He doesn't have it built around him. Bonkers numbers overall. After that, you have Cologne, where they're only 5th to 8th. Again, monstrous numbers. After that, the numbers start to go down. But by the way, notice this. Except for the Challenger stage of E-League Major, notice how for the rest of the majors, yeah, the rating gets bad like here. But aside from that, these numbers are even fine. These are right up to 2019, 2018, they're fine. People don't know that actually, even though Edwards was a massive sore spot in those 2018 onward Navis, where you had Simple popping off and you got Electronic going, it wasn't always at the majors, though, that he had his problems. He was just a fantastic player in general. And then you go and look. If you look year by year, you'll start to really get a sense of what he was like in CSGO. So if you go to the beginning, in 2013, you'll see he has good fragging, not bad. See, he's a solid rifler. This is the year when he gets into Astana Dragons. This is when he has to come back to Navi. He's still got strong fragging, but you can see the ratings are going down a little bit. 2015, still solid. Not bad. Remember, this is a supportive element. These are totally fine numbers for a supportive element at the level he's at in all big finals of lands. 2016, it's still legit. Look at this. Good impact, decent ADR, good frags, still keeping his deaths down. 2017, it's all right still not bad. We're still hanging on. Remember, 2017, guys, he was playing since it was like 2003 or something. 2017, he's still a competent professional at tier 1. 2018, it starts to get worse. The deaths have gone... stayed the same, but the kills have gone way down. Every other stat's going down overall. Yes, obviously at this point it's going to start getting slightly worse. Now we're going even lower on the impact, even lower on the... Then after that, he's not playing in Navi anymore, is he? Then he goes and plays with like a bunch of other CIS squads. You'll see there's no lands going on here. There was just never any more lands at that point in time. So the key thing is, one, he was insane at majors. Like, he could actually have won a couple of CSGO majors. He never won a CSGO major. He was in 3 finals. He obviously wasn't there for the one they won in 2021, but he absolutely could have. Like, for his role, he's actually even a mad slept on sort of like, how did they not win? Same way as Guardian as a primary op. It's like, how did he not win a major? How did this guy as a support not? Like, isn't he even outplaying and putting way crazier numbers than a Zipnix or something like that back in the day? And he's not the main guy they're giving all the resources to, I'm telling you. So I think the problem is this. Now you come to the trickiest part, how I talked about in the intro. There's sort of 3 Edwards. Then there's the Edward that sucks. And that is the latter day Edward from 2018 onwards. Admittedly, he was okay at the majors. And this is just a guy who makes mistakes, who has brain farts, who individually can't keep up, who's fragging can't keep up, who's not at all the player he used to be. And unfortunately, because Simple's having some of the best games ever, is sometimes letting Simple down. Is sometimes a reason why they're not winning majors or winning as many tournaments as they could, or getting as far as they could in the tournament. Even though they're a top team in the world on good salaries, he's a mega veteran. So he played in 3 major finals, but he got 0 major titles. He could have won 1 or 2 at least for my money. Sad thing is, and this is one of the reasons I want to make this video, is people are going to think because he was bad at the end of CSGO that he just sucked in CSGO. That's not true. It was only at the end. He had a whole bunch of years. Let's be real. We're talking like 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. I'd say until 2017, he's still a solid, very good contributing member in Navi in CSGO. In 1.6, he was incredible. He was really one of the best individual players ever. He just doesn't have he has a very good resume, but there are people with different resumes in terms of like individual awards and got more plaudits, etc. I do think he slept on in 1.6 though. And like I say, he not only won many 1.6 majors, 4 in a row, he could have won more. He could have won 5 or 6. And you could even argue because of how good he was in 2008, 2007. Maybe he even could have won more back then, but I'm not trying to extend this too far. In CSGO, he could have won at least 1, maybe 2. By the way, I'll just add this in there. There's that whole simple hint that maybe Guardian actually was talking out of his arse about that injury at Columbus. In which case, maybe Edward was robbed of a major. By the way, he probably would have been the MVP of that. You had the whole thing where later on, they kicked out Zeus when Zeus could have in-game led, but then Valve suddenly made the change to, he would have had to be the in-game leader, but they kicked him out, and Stark's in-game leader, but Stark's is the coach. So now Seized has to take it over. Simple also implied maybe Seized didn't have to, and maybe he wanted to. So you think of all the things that are going on. There's things that other people did that tanked some of Edward's potential to win majors as well. The thing for me of this is, I always thought a massive positive for this guy was his mentality. As a player, just seems like a warrior, a soldier, just does what he's asked to do, plays the spots he's asked to play, and does a good job, whether he's a star or whether he's a supportive element. He's good under pressure, as you saw. I mean, look, if you count CS 1.6 and CSGO, isn't this one of the best players ever at the majors, while also being a really skilled player, not just a flash in the pan? And then I'll add this in there. If you've ever talked to him, you won't see him do many interviews. He's a very actual thoughtful person. He's a very reflective, I would say cerebral individual, and he seems like someone who actually does care a lot about I think he cares a lot about losing and about being the best and about performing well and about being a professional. I think he does care about these things. And it's actually kind of sad, like I say, that he's been so disrespected at the end of his career. When I make content, it isn't just me, the mic, and a guest or a topic. It's also me with the support of my whole crew. Who's that, you might ask? The Skrilluminati. That's who. They include Frisky, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Ahmed Hadjou, Tosh, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Goh, Animosity, Torin, and you know it if you've heard it before, but if you haven't, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Well, if you want to know upcoming topics and guests I'm going to have on my channel, maybe you want to ask me a question to answer in an AMA in video fashion. Do you want to hear one of those long discussions and actually be part of it and be able to ask me questions? Want to find out who I'm going to interview next? If any of these perks or more appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.